record. I'm getting better. I'd like to begin with a long screed on something that was raised by a number of questions that have been popping up over the last few weeks. It's the issue I call cosmetics. This is an issue that has really not been much of an issue in the computer games community. That is, in the games community, let's see. Oh, well, I'll get to your question, Scott, in a few minutes. I want to deal with the cosmetics issue. Within the games community, it is well understood that a good game has to have excellent graphics, sound, and animation, and so forth. These are all just fundamental requirements. And this is now an absolute truth in the games industry. However, I have long argued that I term all of this stuff cosmetics. Some people call it eye candy, whatever. And I've long argued against it, and I lost on that point. Basically, the games industry has definitely gone the way of cosmetics, and I concede defeat on that point. However, I want to point out cosmetics don't make the game. Perhaps they sell the game, which is vitally important, but in terms of gameplay, the essence here is interaction. That's what makes games powerful. That is, if you were to, many times people will record a playing of a game and then put it on YouTube or whatever. People will watch experts playing the games, and basically all they're seeing is pure cosmetics. When you're watching somebody else's game, it's zero interaction from your point of view. And so, although there are some people who do enjoy that, they're really doing it to learn how to play the game better. If you were to take one of these videos of a game being played and in effect try to sell it as a movie, well, it wouldn't sell. It would be a very boring movie. However, in fact, it's interesting to compare. Many times we have seen games turned into movies. They figure, well, we got a whole bunch of people who are playing this game. Maybe we can sell them a movie. And the movies differ from the games in interesting ways. If you compare the game with the movie, what you'll see always is a real shift away from the cosmetic action and much more towards interpersonal interaction. But the point I will make then is that what makes the movie sell is the interpersonal interaction, not the graphics or whatever, because you already got that on the computer. However, I want to point out here that we face a fundamental issue with interactive storytelling. Should this be an evolutionary development of games, or should it be a revolutionary creation of a new industry? And I argue for the latter. The reason not because it's impossible to evolve, we could certainly evolve, but because of the audience expectations. The audience prevents evolution. That is, let's take a successful game right now, and let's imagine, games, we do all of these sequels and improvements and variations on them and so forth. So let's take a really popular game right now, and let's imagine evolving it in two directions. We have two new competing games based on the original. The first game is more gamey. It's better cosmetics, bigger explosions, more interesting weapons and so forth. And the other one evolves in the direction of more interactive drama, more character development, and so forth. And the point I'd like to make is that when these two games compete against each other, this game will win and this game will lose, because this game better fits the definition of games. This does not. In other words, this gives people more of what they want. This gives gamers more of what they want. Now, there are tons of people out there who would much prefer the more dramatic game. That is, most people would rather see human interaction, but they don't buy games, and they probably won't be interested. You can't really reach them unless you have a billion-dollar marketing campaign, which you can't afford. So you're really fighting against the current. You're swimming upstream, trying to evolve games into dramatic, into interactive storytelling. That's why I say this because I spent decades pushing and fighting and arguing for games to have deeper substance to them. Let's not waste so much money on the cosmetics. Let's put more of our effort, energy into the substance of the design. And I lost on every count. I continued doing games with greater substance, and they didn't sell that well. A lot of people looked at them and said, well, that's very interesting, but it's not really a game. And in fact, that was the most common criticism of my works, that they were very interesting designs, very clever, very creative, imaginative, blah, 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 but it's not really a fun game, and so can't be recommended. So anyway, the danger here is that cosmetics, interactive storytelling, as I've said many, many times, is immensely difficult. This is a very difficult challenge, and you cannot afford to waste any of your creative energy on the cosmetics. You're going to have your hands very full just trying to get the storytelling part working properly. And so my argument is, let's make sure we have a cake before we start to put icing on it. Right now, the cakes that I've been baking aren't good enough. They taste bad. And so first we get the cake, then we put the icing on it. And that's the way I feel about cosmetics. So so I suppose I'll summarize by saying, don't waste time on the cosmetics. Barry, you have a question?
So the idea you've put forward for the for like an interactive story, though, based on your lessons, already includes like facial expressions, right?
Yes.
And like that's not just cosmetic, because the facial expression that's sent to you it gives you vital information that you need to respond to.
Yep.
So like your game already has like a look, it already has an interface. Like
yes.
I'm one of the people who wrote a question about how these games look. I wasn't asking like how pretty will it be. I was asking like what kind of vital feedback will you be getting audio visual wise, because like you said, the sentence structures that you've written, because like for the computer to understand them, they have to be super simple and kind of like broken English. And if all the player is doing is reading a series of broken English sentences, they're probably not going to feel very connected to it. And so you need things like facial expressions, which you already have in the game. That was more the question than how pretty will it be.
A gamer certainly would not feel very connected to something with broken English in it. However, I think, and in fact, I doubt that many people would do that until such time as they realize that the interaction they're having really is dramatically interesting. In other words, well, here's an experience I've had that illustrates the point. Many times I've been in a foreign country in which I cannot speak the language, because there are countries that don't speak English. And even in England, I'm not sure I can speak the language. So many times I've been forced to interact with people in a kind of a broken combination of symbols and waving my hands and a few words that I know in the other language. And it is amazing how well you can communicate with people with these broken languages.
You also have the best audio-visual feedback system in the universe. You have your eyes and your ears, and they have a full range of motion.
Mm-hmm.
Like, imagine if you couldn't do this.
That's true. No, that's true. But my point is that we don't need the full range of of expressive possibilities. I think that it is more important to have an interesting character than to have an eloquent but less interesting character. That is, if you really can't interact with them in a very dramatically significant way, there just isn't much point to it. Or there isn't that, it's not that entertaining. So I suppose my point here is we really need to push on providing adequate, dramatically interesting interaction. And that is immensely difficult. And so I'm trying to balance, the amount of work required to get up to just a minimal level on dramatic interaction is enormous. And yeah, sure, we could spend a lot of time on getting really pretty language. In fact, I've already got the technology for doing that. The Tinker Toy text could be extended with enough effort to do all sorts of fabulous things. It's just that it takes a lot of time. And I think it's better to spend the time on the nature of the interaction, on the personalities and the way they behave, the way they react. Above all, the number of verbs. We need a lot more verbs, and getting a big verb set is very difficult. So I wanted to start off with that cautionary note. Let me go over to your email here, Barry. Let's see. Oh, yes. Barry asked an interesting question about how different the human player is from the computer characters. And it's always easy to, one of the design tricks every designer uses is to give the player special capabilities that the computer characters don't have. And in fact, there are also games where computer characters have capabilities the human doesn't have. You differentiate them. My goal has always been to have the human and the computer characters having access to exactly the same verbs. The way my designs have worked is that at any point, the human could switch to a different character and the computer could take over his character. And, it could also work in multiplayer situations where people drop in and drop out and jump in. And I've always felt there should be absolute symmetry here. It has a lot of development advantages in that you can more readily see how things are unfolding. And well, it's not necessary. You certainly can equip the human with capabilities that the computer characters don't have. You can give the human access to verbs that computer characters don't have. But I've always pushed for absolute equality on that issue. Let's see, and oh boy, do I want to talk. I'm going to put off discussions of languages, of linguistic expressions. This is a big subject. I've spent many years researching all sorts of weird language systems. And there are, I mean, the obvious thing is just use straight English or broken English, but there are a great many interesting variations. There's a thing nearly 100 years old called Basic English. There have been a number of these boiled down versions of English. There are a whole bunch of symbolic languages like Bliss symbolics, Loglan, and then its successor, Lobjan, or something like that. There are just a whole bunch of, there's a huge field called constructed languages, or as they say, conlangs. And there are hundreds of these. You know, just like every programmer wants to design his own programming language, every linguistics student wants to design his own natural language. And like I say, there are a zillion of these things, and most of them are crap, but a lot of them have some interesting ideas in them. One of them that I'm looking at right now, Tokipos, I can't remember the name, Tokiposi, very interesting concept built around the philosophy of Taoism, a minimalist philosophy. And then but I keep coming back to the idea of an iconic language, as a language based on symbols. Anyway, basically there has to be a language of interaction. This is a huge subject, and I believe we get to it sometime later. Let's see. Okay, Scott asked the question, is there an Excel sample available of a minimal follow array dictionary? I don't understand the question, Scott. What do you mean by follow array dictionary?
In one of your previous, I don't know if it was part of the lesson sequence, but in one of your writings, you were talking about creating a follow function. Yeah, I think it was. And it was like a one big long and or function, and it would access an array that had a bunch of Booleans as far as what word might follow another word. Kind of a dictionary.
Yes, that's the system I used with the very first C-Boot game. However, and there was, it was the inverse for the inverse parser. And one of the hilarious things about it was there was one line of code that was immensely long, that had all of these Boolean expressions jammed together. And basically this one line would perform all of the calculations of the inverse parser. I subsequently replaced that with a much better system of algorithms, and it is built into the, it is what we are just now beginning to talk about in lessons 13 and 14. And in fact, we will hit it directly in lesson 15. So no, I don't use a table anymore. The system I developed, I think, is much more flexible and easier to use. Let's see, interaction is defined by feedback, audio, visual. Yeah, definitely as part of the in order to have dramatic interaction, you've got to be able to communicate. I would argue that the primary mode of dramatic interaction is language, natural language. And so language is an immensely important element. Faces are also very important, but they are not absolutely required in the way. For example, we have novels, and novels have no faces, just text, just language, and they work very well. So yeah, we got to have a natural language or something, some kind of linguistic interface. And again, I have spent an enormous amount of time researching various linguistic schemes. One of the cutest one was something designed by a French fellow in 1820 or so called Sol-Risol. A very cute system with just 8 basic letters of his alphabet. And they were do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. And he also had a system for each of these. He had corresponding numbers, corresponding symbols, and corresponding colors. And the result was that you could words were built by combining these letters. So do, la meant this, and mi, fa, do meant something else. And the cute thing was that you could express this in any medium at all. So he had a system where ships could communicate with colored flags, and you could communicate by sound. You could in effect sing the language. There were a lot of other things. Very clever system, but with just 8 characters, I mean, imagine how many words could you build with an alphabet of just 8 letters? That's the problem. You end up for a lot of words having a lot of letters to make one word, rather like some of the Polynesian languages, like Hawaiian, which has a very small set of phonemes, and so the words in Hawaiian are very long. Anyway, let's see. Max, a question about verbs. How do you handle the fact that some verbs must be available in a particular situation moment and not in another? Like how to handle in a situation, in a simple way, the situation verbs. We're coming to that. That will come in lesson 15 about the selection of options. Actually, the way you select them is a 2-step process. The first step is roles. That is, each role has its own set of optional verbs. And so you can have one verb takes place, and there can be half a dozen roles associated with that verb. Each of the roles could have half a dozen options associated with it. So we break it down in 2 steps. And those steps turn out to be fairly natural steps. They break it down along the dramatic grain of this wood, as it were. So we'll get to that. A lot of you are always one step ahead of me, asking questions about things that, you know, we'll get to those in just next lesson. Just wait a little. But actually, it's really good that you guys are ahead of me at every step, you know, wanting to know, okay, what's next? What's next? So it means that you understand the current state of the lessons perfectly. Subsidiary question. How to make sure the verbs in our game have real impacts on the story and actually extend the possibilities of interactions with the NPCs, etc. Paul asked much the same question the other day. In fact, I found out, I thought that question was addressed in a future lesson, and I went ahead and looked for it, and turns out, no, it's not. There are actually 2, what I call this consequences. That is, when a verb takes place, it's going to change the world. how does it change the world? Where there are two types of consequences. I call them physical consequences and emotional consequences. The physical consequences are associated directly with the verb, and they pop up in a little menu. By the way, I just added it. Let's see. I added it to lesson 14. No. I'm sure I made that. Yes, I added it to lesson 14. Right at the end, there's a little bitty box in the editor that's called consequences. And you can click on that and get nested pop-up menus that allow you to specify the changes in the physical world as a result of the execution of the verb. And then later on, there is a, for each role, there are emotional consequences, and those are specified in a different place. But I'll caution you, one of the problems I've been struggling with throughout this process, I don't want to drag you down my path too far. Because my system, well, it's the best we've got right now, but we need to be thinking in terms of alternatives. And so I try to give you the absolute minimum required to understand my technology conceptually. I don't want to teach you how to code this thing up. Maybe you should. I'm certainly not denying you that. If you want to, go right ahead. But I think it would be a disservice to you as students for me to only tell you about, my glorious, wonderful technology. So I want you to understand it at the conceptual level. But in a number of cases, you guys are asking very detailed questions that really go right into the specifics of it. So a tough problem. I don't know how to solve it. Just wanted to point out that of Chris's games, I enjoyed playing Balance of the Planet the most, partly because it has nice illustrations. I felt it added a lot to the gameplay, even though it wasn't interactive. Yeah, Paul, are you referring to the first Balance of the Planet or the one I did in 2010, I think?
I think it's the older one because I played it on an emulator like at least 10 years ago, so it would have been probably the older one.
It had the artwork, not photographs.
Yeah, it was just drawings, like black and white drawings with a little head and so on. I thought those were interesting drawings. Like, they weren't cutting edge graphics, but they added a lot to the experience because they portrayed the interactions in the game, like explaining what solar power looked like and what falling off a roof looked like and so on.
Yeah, there is a useful story behind that, two aspects of it. One, back in those days, we were very limited in capacity. These things were delivered over floppy disks that didn't hold that much information. Typical floppy disk held what, 160 kilobytes, or no, they were bigger than that, 320. They were still in the hundreds of kilobytes range. Well, one photograph today can take 6 megabytes. Even a small photograph can still take hundreds of kilobytes. And so we had like 90 different elements or active components in that game. And so we would have needed 90 of these. And I'm sorry, we can't ship 90 floppies. So we needed a way to, this was very common back then, we needed a way to have good images that didn't take up much space. And what we came up with was a combination of a simple bitmap with a bunch of colored triangles to augment it. and the system was very conservative. It didn't take a whole lot of memory. I don't know how many floppies Balance the Planet. I think it was 3 or 4. But we were really pushing the technology, getting that working. The other interesting thing about that was that I went to an artist to do all of that stuff. Not a graphical artist, but a woman who created images that, you know, very minimalist images that had strong emotional content. And she did a magnificent job with those images. It was, I think that her artistic sensibility contributed an enormous amount to the effectiveness of that design. So I'll still say that the new one is much better because it's bigger, it's more complicated in its internal structure, and it uses beautiful photographs in most cases. But actually more important, it also provides much more information for feedback in terms of, well, just so you can understand how things work. And it's got all sorts of interesting back reference material, so an enormous amount of that. Let's see. Related to lesson 14, for every event, multiple roles may have an opportunity to react. If they all did react, we could end up with a chain reaction that would overwhelm the player. And furthermore, this would be a tree of events, not a story, which is a sequence of events. I would assume we generally need to choose only the one most relevant reaction. How do you deal with this? Well, remember, in most cases, the only person who reacts to an event is going to be the direct object. In other words, the vast majority of dramatic interaction is this guy does something to this guy does something back to him, and then he does something back to them, back and forth and back and forth. That's the vast majority of interaction, and that just has one role associated with it, the direct object. There are situations, though, where you might want other people to be able to interact. And you could have multiple interactions, although in most cases, in order to deal with this tree geometric explosion problem that you cite, there's this a feature I call hijacking. It's just a Boolean flag you can set that says only one person or if this person reacts, then he hijacks the storyline and prevents any other reactions from taking place. In other words, if Joe insults Fred and Fred shouts at Joe, suddenly Joe's girlfriend can hijack the storyline and say, stop this right now, this very minute. And she prevents Joe from punching Fred or whatever. So yes, you can have that. I actually think that I went too far with that. I actually think it would be simpler to just say all of these things are simple back and forth interactions. So first, one pair of actors go back and forth, then they stop. And then in another stage, more back and forth. And then this guy from this stage meets that guy from that stage in a third pair, and they go back and forth. I think that's probably a better way to do it. It's simpler. And yes, there are situations that it does not permit. But in practice, I found that those situations were rare. So you can get away with the simpler thing of just, in fact, I think it would be even simpler to just say, always, on any stage, there are only two people, and they just interact with each other, and then they break up. It's always done on a pairwise basis. One easy way to implement this, by the way, and this is an artifice, just for getting started, is to have it be strictly a telephone game. Just people talking to each other over the phone. And that way it's necessarily two people. And so all you do is just call people. That might be a good way to get started so that you avoid all of this complexity of groups of people. The absolute worst problem I'll mention is what I call the meetings problem, where one player wants to address a bunch of people. One player stands up and says, "Okay, everybody, I got news for you." And then starts talking to them all, and everybody is reacting to that. My technology can handle that, but oh boy, it can be a real headache dealing with it. So over and over, as you look into my technology, you'll see all of these wonderful things that have been implemented that, wow, are really impressive and are very seldom used. And so really, I suspect any good interactive storytelling system that eventually works is going to be a subset of mine, of my technology. So anyway, let's see. So we talked about roles. By the way, the idea of the, wait a minute. What else about verbs? There was another point I wanted to make about verbs. Oh, yes. Verbs are far and away the most important component of any story world. Almost all of your work will be on verbs, on just making the verbs work. Verbs are huge data structures in terms of the, you know, the size of the file that you end up building. The verbs take up 90% of that file. So really, it's defining verbs is a lot of work, because for each verb, you've got a number of intrinsic things you've got to define, like, you know, consequences. Oh, the abort, that was another one that I stuck in that shouldn't have been there. That's the ability to abort a verb, the execution of a verb, between the time when it has been set as a plan and the time that it is executed. In all the story worlds I built, I never once used that feature. Another good example of just going too far, trying to be too clever. So again, simplify, simplify, simplify. And then there was the idea, the concept of a role is definitely taken directly from cinema. I have told you earlier that you really need to learn from the other narrative media and embrace much of their terminology and, more important, much of their way of thinking. And roles are a classic example of that. Although roles in my technology mean something a little different from roles in the movies. In the movies, a role is actually simply assigned to one character, whereas in mine, a role can be almost anything that and is highly variable. A role is confined to a single verb. That is, when this verb takes place, it has its roles, and when that verb takes place, it has its roles. And it is entirely possible that one character could be in different roles for different verbs, or even different roles for the same verb when it's executed several times. So we have this verb and it's executed, and this Fred here plays this role, And then a little while later, same verb is executed, but now Fred is in a different role. So a role is specific to a verb, and it basically defines the situation. It defines the dramatic relationships. And so you might think of a role as being the most common role is direct object, the person who's the verb is being done to. But you could also think of them as, angry boyfriend, upset girlfriend, protective big brother, cuckolded husband, so forth. Let's see. So, any other questions? Anything about these two lessons? Should we? Oh, go ahead, Barry.
Does a character, before they interact, do they have to get assigned a role? Like, is that how you know what they're going to do? Or,
yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
So every time a character does something, it gets assigned a role.
No, every time. Well, every time a verb is executed, there are roles associated with the verb.
Okay, so do you have to create theoretically there's millions of possibilities in one of these story worlds. So what exactly does a role define? Because obviously every single unique interaction doesn't have a role.
It defines a dramatic situation to a verb. So if we have a verb like punch, Joe punches Fred, the most common verb would be direct object, or most common role would be direct object. Fred is the direct object. So what's Fred going to do about being punched? But you could also conceivably have roles like, girlfriend of the person who was punched. And she said, "Oh, don't hit my boyfriend."
So if we have the indirect object of getting punched, does being the indirect object of the punch just define that they have to react to the punch? Like what about being the indirect object? Like, how do you know what they're going to do?
You specify, if each role specifies the options, what they could do.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay.
So, let's see. Yeah, the concept is a little artificial, and so it does take a bit of work to grasp how it functions. Again, this is one of these things where once you've used it, it does indeed make a great deal of sense, but it's rather like looking at a odd tool and thinking, what the hell does this do? And then somebody says, well, it's an apple corer, and you just stick an apple in and do this, and out comes the apple. And, oh yeah, of course. So it does look a little odd at first, but again, once you've used it. Let me ask, should we be taking more? I mean, is 2 lessons too few? Should we try doing 3 lessons per week? By the way, I'm adding some more lessons, but the fact that there aren't that many questions suggests that there wasn't enough material.
I feel like this week specifically, it's a lot of pretty objective information. It's pretty clear. Like, I read it and I was like, yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
I think it depends of the lessons actually.
Yeah.
Sometimes 2 is a lot, sometimes it's not.
Yeah, the lessons are, I really need to rewrite the whole thing and sort of try to make sure each lesson is about the same amount of information. It's just that it's difficult. I mean, some of these things are very abstruse, some of the stuff on processing, and that was pretty serious stuff. Let's see. I'm looking at future lessons. Sappho, language, and dicto. Now, language is going to be a big one. Let me see what I have on that. Yeah, that's a fairly large one. And there's a lot of material I'd like to add to it. So language and dicto is a big one. Sappho, this is the scripting language. And oh boy. Remember how I said every programmer likes to create his own programming language? Well, I did too. As Sappho is programming language I created for this, and I am actually quite proud of it. It has a lot of really weird ideas in it. So I don't know. Open floor. We got 15 minutes to kill here. What would you guys like to talk about? General questions. Paul. Yeah.
My thought was, have you ever took a story or a collection of story, like let's say Grimm's fairy tales or something, and tried to adapt them to a story world to see how all the verbs in a short story translate to your system, and if it's as entertaining, or if you could get the same things to play out in your story world as in classic stories?
Actually, there's a very interesting story about that. About 8 years ago, there's an academic conference every year called ICIDS about interactive storytelling. And they publish their, proceedings of their thing every year. And if you want to waste a lot of money, normally proceedings cost like $50 per volume. If you want to waste $50, you can buy one of these things. It's spelled ICIDS. Is the conference. You can look it up, and I've actually keynoted it, I think twice now, and given papers a couple of other times. It is, it's actually rather sad. The academics are trying very hard to do it in an academic way, and as such, they're not really making much progress. The worst thing about, or the most depressing thing, is that you read the papers, and if I were to show you proceedings from different years, but didn't tell you which years they were, you wouldn't be able to tell which year they're from, because there's no progress. They just keep spinning the same wheels over and over again. There's a little progress, primarily in nomenclature, and they refer to each other, and they like to say, well, so-and-so in this paper said this, but you don't really see much in the way of development, intellectual development. Anyway, one year, about 8 years ago, they thought it would be a good idea to have a challenge. And so the challenge was build an interactive story world about the Red Riding Hood story. And it was that I had difficulty at first because it was put together by a German group, and the German name for the story is Little Red Cap. And I had no idea what they were talking about. And it took me months. I just sort of threw it aside. I don't know what they're talking about. But then figured out, about a month before the deadline, what they were talking about. And one of my collaborators, Jonathan Bereklev, actually put together a Little Red Riding Hood story world that, well, the problem is that any existing story is already defined. A story world generates stories. And so in effect, what you're trying to do is take a, go on, is to, with what, in any of these cases, you're trying to take an existing story and make it into a tree. And so then you have to consider alternate possibilities. And the difficulty is, how do you bushify Little Red Riding Hood? You know, maybe she eats the wolf. You know, she falls in love with the wolf. They get married and live happily ever after. Grandma eats Little Red Riding Hood. You know, there just aren't that many interesting or plausible variations on this. You know, Little Red Riding Hood gets lost in the forest and never makes it to Grandma's house. You know, there just aren't that many useful variations. And so this is very difficult. It's even more difficult with some stories like, you know, Romeo and Juliet. You know, how are you going to vary that? You know, I suppose, I mean, you could cook up some variations, but none of them would be as powerful as the original. And that's the problem. A finished story is polished and perfected. And when you try to make a million variations on it, all of those variations are going to be inferior. And so everybody else is going to look at it and say, well, you made it worse. So really, in creating a story world, the best way, again, is to use a character-based approach rather than plot-based approach. That is, just say, I'm going to create some interesting characters in an interesting situation, and let's see how they interact with each other. So think of it as, you know, we're putting all these people into a pot. Let's let the pot bubble and see what comes out of it. I think that's a better way to approach the design of a story world. Let's see, because most of what happens in a story world is not pre-written, I guess it does mean that most games are highly replayable. Do you think it's interesting to make a game the players can play several times with a different perspective each time? Yes, that I think is one of the really useful aspects of story worlds. There's a classic Japanese movie where the movie is, and this trick has been done in a few other movies, but it was first done by, I believe, Akira Kurosawa, in which you have this event which is shown 7 times from the point of view of 7 different characters. Does anybody remember the title of that movie?
Rashomon, I think it was. Yeah, Rashomon.
Yeah, yeah, and Rashomon, yes, and it was, the whole idea was everybody had a completely different interpretation of the events, and so what is truth? And boy, a story world could do that very well. So instead of just replaying it, you play it once as this character and then as that character, and so on and so forth. That, I think, is a very powerful idea. I considered it at a few points and told myself someday I got to do that, but never got around to it. So that's certainly a possibility to explore. Let's see. As far as replayability, though, I've had mixed feelings on this. I initially started off, you know, with the goal of infinite replayability, and I have decided to reduce that somewhat, quite a bit, in fact. With Le Mort d'Arthur, I am now thinking in terms of 3 or 4 playings. I won't go into the reasons why. Let's see, Barry, did you start this conference? Where did you get the language of interactive story worlds, and do they mean it the same way you do? No, I did not start this conference. I had my own conference for a while that I called, workshop, Greek word, frontisterion. And I had it here at my house. And so it was along the classic lines of the small group workshop in the woods, and, you know, nice, you know, pleasant environment, you know, free discussion. And I think these conferences were very successful in that after many years of experience, I've learned how to run group discussions in ways to make them fairly productive. But in the end, I don't think the community was really ready. The discussions were still a little too random, and they were too speculative. And so I stopped doing them because I felt, moreover, there was a serious two cultures problem. I really tried to tackle that. Two cultures. British fellow about 1958. Did I tell you about two cultures? British fellow, 1958, C.P. Snow, published an essay entitled The Two Cultures. And the essay became so popular that he ended up writing a book about it. The basic concept was that the Western intellectual community, at one time, the arts and the sciences were pretty closely tied together. Einstein played the violin. Back in the 1930s, scientists could get together and they could talk about theater or painting, sculpture, or quantum mechanics. You know, it was, if you were an educated person, you were educated in all these dimensions. Well, with World War II and the dramatic increase in spending on the sciences, the two communities pulled apart, and now we have completely separate cultures. Science, technology, engineering, and arts and humanities. And these cultures are pulled so far apart that they are simply independent now. They can't even talk to each other. And I have spent a lot of time trying to bridge this chasm. And it is immensely difficult because people on two sides of this, on the different sides, just speak in very different ways. They think in very different ways. It is, it's quite frustrating. It is especially bad here in the United States, where the two cultures simply have nothing to do with each other, and in fact regard each other with mutual contempt. You know, the artists, humanities people look at the scientists, they call them pointy heads. And the science and engineering people look at the arts people and call it basket weaving. And it's really sad. I've long felt that Europe has a big advantage in this, in that in Europe, you can't get away from the arts. They're all around you. They have statues in the goddamn cities. You know, in my town, Medford is the nearest town to me, big town. They wanted to put up just a little sculpture thing at one of the main entrances to the city. And there was huge controversy over this. You want to spend $30,000 on a sculpture? What the hell are you thinking? You know, that's not the way it works in Europe. So anyway, the two cultures problem is greatly interfering with our progress here, because interactive storytelling, you got to do technology, you got to do the arts. You got to be good in both. There's simply no way. And I will mention, I've got something cute here that I'd like to show you. There have been a lot of ideas. Whoop, come on, baby. Here we go. Come on, where is that? Here it is. A lot of people have said, okay, look, let's just combine the two. We'll put together a team with, some artists and some programmers, engineers, and so forth. And this team will do interactive storytelling, and we'll have the best of both worlds. Really good artists, really good engineers, and they'll make it happen. And this image I just sent you, let's see if I can make it work. There is sort of my way of representing that concept. If we put a shark, can you guys see that now? If you put a shark together with a tiger, you don't get a better predator. The shark does really well in water, and the tiger does really well on the land, and together they don't accomplish anything. And that's what's happened. I've seen a lot of these partnership projects, and they have all been miserable failures. The European Union put something together about 10, 12 years ago, this joint, basically it was interactive storytelling, but we're going to get people together from all the great universities in Europe, and they had a big budget, and they spent 2 years working together, and they accomplished absolutely nothing. It's got to be inside one brain. There's no way around that. I have worked with artists and tried really, really hard, but in the end, a partnership doesn't work.
So how do we bridge the gap?
You have to bridge it inside your own mind.
Hmm.
You've got to, let me just confirm, raise your hand if you were trained in technology, science or technology. Okay, everybody. And then raise your hand if you were trained primarily in the arts. Oh, okay. Well, that's good. That's very good. In fact, my own guess or hunch is that it would be easier for people who start off in the arts to then learn how to program than it would be for people who were trained in the sciences to learn how to do art. So that's just a personal impression, but by all means, that's how it has to be done. You've got to straddle that gap inside your own head. I think that's the only way to happen. I would honestly love to hear the reasons you're imagining Le Mort d'Arthur to be played only 3 or 4 times. I won't answer that now because it's too long, but what I will do is take a note and write an essay on Le Mort d'Arthur at some point so that we can talk about it, because there are a lot of good ideas in Le Mort d'Arthur. Let's see. I feel that the best is to be an artistic person with technical capacities. Yeah, okay. Okay, no tech training, just English course. Okay. So, by the way, yes, I am writing more stuff that I have not yet put into the official outline of the course. In fact, if you go to the last official lesson in the course, you will see that there are a whole bunch of additional things tacked on there at the end. And in fact, let me, oh, no, I haven't even, there's still some stuff I haven't even uploaded yet. So there are about 3 or 4 more lessons in there that I have not yet integrated into the main course. So, okay, so for next week, we're going to be doing 15 and 16. Let's see, yeah, and this pretty big hunk of stuff. I'm going to be adding some stuff on the language and dicto thing, or at least linking to some other stuff I've written. And yeah, so you might want to check on the language and dicto essay late this week, because I will, early in the week, I'll be trying to add a little bit of material to it. So, okay. Any last questions? Yeah, Ivan. Oh, yeah. We need to talk. Go ahead.
Thank you. I asked you about the Laura Mixon Shattered Sky.
Yes, yes.
Because I saw that on your site. And how did it end? How did the Star Wall went? Was it
that was the first project we attempted, and that was more than 20 years ago. And so it was very primitive by its standards, or by current standards. It was a good idea, and but she had some serious problems. Her worst problem was that she was trying, like me, she was trying to do too much. I mean, we were both, we were working together in partnership, and we kept coming up with these neat ideas. Ooh, let's add this. And then she felt required to somehow build it into the story world. And that's absolutely the wrong way. Never, ever, ever work from technology to art. Always work from art to technology. That is, first set your artistic goals and then ask, how can I achieve that goal? There's a very bad habit a lot of people do, which I call technological opportunism, which is, ooh, we got this really neat new technology. I wonder what I can make with it. That's okay. That's good for research. Very bad for development. That is, if you're just playing around with something and you want to make, oh, here's a neat toy. That's great. That's how we make great discoveries. But that's not how you design a product. So. And lastly, I want to bring everybody up to date on the multidimensional analysis thing. Ivan and I have been working on it. There is you can find some discussion of it at the very end. In fact, I might as well just jump ahead and give you the URL. Here's the latest version of what I am now proposing that the user would see. And look it over if you wish, and if you have any suggestions, ideas, whatever. In fact, Ivan, you're going to start working on it on Wednesday?
Well, yep. And right now, just before the session, I created the server, the web server. And now during the evening, I'll try to make some examples into the database and stuff, so I can send you some XML or whatever.
Okay, I am still working hard on getting you the character set images. There are a lot of them, and each one has to go. I have to do a lot of graphic work on it. I am going to cut back on the number of characters. The number of characters I list there is just way too many. I'm going to cut down on the number of movies and so forth. So but in the end, I will have a set for, oh, and one small point, I should have said this, but I'm assuming that the character images will be 128 by 140, I think, 128 by 142. And I think that will give us enough space to work on, to look right on most computer screens. So, but if you find that it's not fitting right or whatever, just tell me and propose a different dimensions and we'll make it work.
I think it will make work. If we do the radial system of the sphere, I think that this will work.
Okay. By the way, I just added this. I didn't mean, when I showed the lines, I didn't mean to imply that they have to move along the lines. That would be too much work for you.
Yeah, indeed.
Just let them, click and drag and drop.
Yeah. I'll let the user to move the pictures, and then
Yeah.
we'll calculate the distance.
Yeah, and then
That's all.
Yeah, much easier that way. So, okay. Well then, I'll see you guys next week. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Chris.
Bye.
Bye.